Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 31st of January, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your Alaska weather. That first step is you're watching the show right now, and we thank you for joining us tonight. But we also know that sometimes you're just not able to watch, and you can always subscribe to the show on YouTube if you'd like to watch that on your phone or wherever you are on the go. That's an easy way to do it, and if you subscribe, you'll be notified when the next show is available, so you don't have to wait around the TV. It's a great way to do it. Simply look for AKwx TV on the YouTube search bar there, and then hit subscribe. We'd love to see you there. Find us at the Alaska Weather Information Line, 1-800-472-0391. The website, always up and running, weather.gov/Alaska. And if you can't find what you're looking for, send me an email there. On our website as well, if you click on the TV page, you'll be able to see all of the images from tonight's show, as well as a very quick summary brief with the surface weather charts that you like to see, and about 2.5 minutes long, so slick and quick if you want to get out the door. That's posted in the mid to late afternoon, and then the show can be found a little bit later on in the evening, online, of course. Let's take a look at Thompson Pass. We were talking about the DOT crews yesterday, and one of the groups that we talked to are some of the folks that maintain the Thompson Pass area, and you can see they've been through several swipes today. Looks like a little bit of blowing and drifting snow, but certainly not as bad as it was earlier this morning and overnight. Looks like maybe another pass to do the trick, guys, but hey, it looks like a great job there, and the weather looks beautiful. You can see a little bit of blue sky up there at times, and certainly some nice sunshine hitting the snow. So maybe an improving day around Thompson Pass, and our hats off again to the Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities. Across southeast, you can see wind is going to be a problem for northern sections there. We're going to check on some of the wind gusts in just a moment. But you'll notice the red areas there around Douglas Island and around Juneau and south indicates a high wind warning. We are expecting some strong winds to begin, and they are beginning now, and will continue to ramp up all the way through Friday and into Saturday night, in fact, for high winds. Gusts may peak Friday night around 75 miles per hour coming out of the canals and out of the drainages there. You're going to get a decent wind, and some of that will be coming out of the Taku Valley. So be prepared, as you have no doubt experienced this before. Chances are you're going to be in for a decent amount of wind this time. Now look up further northward toward the Klondike Highway and White Pass. A wind chill advisory is posted. That too will go through about the same time frame. Wind chill values may dip to about 45 below, with the worst of it probably being around Friday night and early Saturday morning there around the White Pass region. So if you're coming and going in and out of Canada, or you're expecting people to do so, make sure they know that it's a good idea to have some extra preparations there in the back trunk or something in case something happens. You got to pull off the road. Wind chill is 45 below in just a matter of minutes, or you can get some nasty frostbite. So make sure you're prepared for that in case something bad happens. And again, high wind watch is posted for that area as well, just in case the winds come up a little bit more sharply in that region. So the Lynn Canal, Chatham Strait, any north-south oriented strait is going to have a lot of wind rushing through it there, and you're going to see that in the marine weather here in just a little bit. Let's look up north quickly. Many of the highway passes there across the northern interior are going to be susceptible to some blowing wind in the coming days there. The Steese, the Elliott, among a few of those. And winter weather advisories are posted for those regions, again, mainly for the highway passes, especially above 2,000 feet. So watch for occasional gusts. Watch for that wind chill to drop, too, if you run into that. But the main issue is really going to be that blowing and drifting snow that limits your visibility for a moment or two. And again, you might want to hold on to the wheel. So be careful. If you're on the Dalton Highway, that's included there. Just make sure that you plan for that eventuality. And then out to the west, the orange areas, what we're talking about is a winter storm watch for the Yukon Delta up into the lower Yukon Valley, all along the southern Seward Peninsula coastline into the Chukchi Coast as well, including Kotzebue up toward Point Hope. And for sure, St. Lawrence Island and Little Diomede, we're looking at what could be a pretty good snow producer, maybe as much as 11 to 12 inches of snow, especially for the Bering Strait region here. But we're also going to be dealing with gusts up to about 60 miles per hour. It looks a lot more likely that you'll see snow from St. Lawrence Island northward But the question mark is going to be this area here around the Yukon Delta. That includes Hooper Bay, Grayling, just to name a few. There is going to be a pretty decent surge of warmer air, and mixed precipitation could move through. It could be all rain, freezing on contact. So it looks like we're going to draw a question mark here, but if you see later on today, if you're watching the weather tonight and early tomorrow, if this changes to a winter weather advisory, that's what's going on. If this changes to a blizzard warning, that's what we're talking about. And maybe it's a winter storm warning, but at this point it's a watch, and we want you to be prepared and aware that winter weather is coming in some shape or fashion. So as we get a little more information, you'll see those changes there, especially around the Yukon Delta. I bet is where you're going to see that. Now let's take a look at the wind gusts around southeast. Back to the wind here. You'll notice these are gusts at around the 3 o'clock hour. We saw wind gusts in the teens, 20-mile-an-hour range, and then you get down into the Lynn Canal a little bit further southward. Here's Juneau for reference, Haines and Skagway up here. Gust to 55 in the canal, 90 miles per hour there just north of Juneau, and as you get into the Chatham Strait, 78 miles an hour there. So a lot of wind rushing through already, and this is just the beginning of this weather situation. We expect this to continue. We're going to see wind pumping out of Cross Sound, out of Yakutat, out of Prince William Sound, especially the Copper River Valley there in the Delta. I would expect to see some gusts in that northern coastal areas. And we're probably going to get a little wind around Anchorage too. Watch as this weather picture unfolds. One area of low pressure is dropping southward. The high, remember, started up here. It's moving east and southeast into western sections of the Yukon and pushing that cold and dry air. And once it gets closer to southeast, it's going to have no trouble at all rushing through those canyons and canals and those valleys there. It's what it wants to do. It is gravity driven, it's pressure driven. All of these things combined are just going to make a rushing of that wind into the region. Now, a look out west shows another situation that's developing. What we're seeing out there across the western Yukon and the Bering Strait region and the northwest coast is associated with a different weather pattern entirely. This is that cold air draining away toward the lower 48 and the western Pacific. This is warm and wet air on the other side of the upper level weather pattern that's filling in that gap. And we get that warm and wet rush moving into southwestern Alaska. Around St. Lawrence Island, we can see the clouds already advancing to your area. And it looks like that snow and blowing snow, the real threat's going to begin as we get into tomorrow and into Saturday. For southwestern Alaska, the main issue is really going to be that mixed precipitation, probably that starts to move into your area as we get into Friday night and into Saturday there. For South Central, we've been dealing with fog, and up and down Cook Inlet, it's been kind of a murky mess at times. The fog monster hovering over Kenai late into the afternoon, and a lot of that's on the road. So if you're driving up and down the Sterling Highway, up around the Glen, the Seward Highway, you're probably running into some of that fog there. And if you are driving, even though the sun may be out, those roads could be just nasty slick there. So be extra careful there. Certainly don't want to hear about you sliding off anywhere. Out across the interior, air quality remains a concern for the middle Tanana Valley thanks to high pressure just sitting right on top of you. But that pressure gradient is also what's adding into some of the wind developing across the northern Bering, also across the northern parts of southeast, and will be the main player as we go through the rest of your weekend. As the front moves north and east toward southwestern Alaska and the Bering Strait communities, it is going to have kind of a forceful push to it. As that happens, we have a much better chance of getting some sizable amounts of snow, especially on the northern side of this, where we have a lot of lifting possible with that frontal boundary itself. That's kind of like driving a snow wedge into your snow pile. It lifts that snow up, and that's exactly what this frontal boundary is going to do as it moves northward toward the Bering Strait. Low pressure is going to hover across the northern Gulf. It's got a front drape through it across the eastern Gulf, and this is allowing that colder air to push out to sea a little bit. But notice how tightly these pressure lines are packed across southeast, especially in northern southeast, especially across the Copper River Valley, and especially across some of our mountain passes there as you go further and further north. As we get into Friday, the front is going to linger right across the outer coast, so that is going to keep that very sharp gradient right across the panhandle throughout your Friday. And again, remember we said those peak wind gusts in northern parts of southeast and including the capital city, we're probably going to ramp up and peak around Friday night with gusts to 75 miles per hour. That could also include some areas around the Copper River Delta, so as that wind is blowing offshore, it's going to be drawn into this area of low pressure here. You can see that tight packing all the way into the Copper River Valley. Low pressure is going to sit just south of Kodiak Island. That's that first wave that's moving north. This is going to start to fall apart a little bit more across the northern Bering Sea, but the surface front is not the only part that's lifting this moisture northward. So just because that front starts to fall apart on the map, it doesn't go away. The snow is still going to be with us, and watch how that warm air quickly builds in across southwest. Another surge reforms, and across the Bering Strait we get ample opportunity for wind, for snow, and for poor visibility there. So again, it looks like a healthy opportunity for accumulating snow around St. Lawrence Island, Gamble, and Savunga, around the Chukchi coast, and all the way down until you get into about Norton Sound. And then south of that, there's a question mark. Like I said, this could be something that turns into a little more rain and frozen rain, maybe even some sleet, and maybe initially is snow. So winter storm watches posted for this entire region, with a much better chance of snow the further north you get. As you move down the coast, there is going to be plenty of wind for Bristol Bay as well. Watch for rough seas and choppy conditions, really just snotty all the way across the Aleutian chain. Snow filling in behind that, a 964 millibar low. And if you think this is it, no, this pattern continues well into next week and the next, with a trough across the west and that cold ridge of high pressure across the east. So it looks like this is going to be kind of the trend that we go through as we get through the next week, at least into February. Another push of colder air probably moving through southeast as we get into Saturday. So cold and wind coming your way. Here's temperatures Friday morning. Quick check here. Teens and 20s for southeast, and it looks like single-digit temps back in order for the Cook Inlet region. As you move north of the Alaska Range, that's where all the cold is. Anywhere from 15 to about 30 below for Fort Yukon, Arctic Village, and Aktuvik Pass. The North Slope, anywhere from 20 to about 27 below around Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse, some of the cold stuff there. 5 to 10 below for Kotzebue Sound, 5 to 10 above for Norton Sound, 9 above for Gamble and Savunga. Southwest temperatures in the teens. McGrath, though, a little bit colder, around 10. Bristol Bay temps in the teens, 20s, even 30s as you get out toward the chain. High temperatures then on Friday afternoon, back in the teens for the Cook Inlet region, 36 in Kodiak, closer to 40 for Cold Bay and King Cove, 20s, maybe even 30 for parts of southeast. Yakutat, 24. Fairbanks, about 2 below. Tanana, about the same, colder in Fort Yukon.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And time for a look at your aviation charts. IFR is going to start moving in towards southwestern Alaska as we go through the rest of the weekend. You're going to notice this band moving north and east into the Bering Strait. And we're also looking at the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula, including areas around Sand Point, and sneaking into False Pass, King Cove, probably looking at least a chance of IFR throughout the day. We're also watching the morning around the Kenai Peninsula and the Cook Inlet region, all the way from the Matsu, probably down past Kenai, maybe into Soldotna and Kachemak Bay. This is going to be due to fog and stratus right over the inlet. Now, there are some possibilities that this is going to change. So if you see some big changes as we get into your Friday morning, you wake up tomorrow and go, where's that IFR? The weather pattern may have shifted just a few miles, and it's going to make all the difference in how much IFR we see up and down the inlet tomorrow. For southeast, you know you have weather moving in, but the good news is it's going to be an offshore push. That air coming through the gaps will likely be limiting any visibility or sealing issues, despite having a lot of turbulence to deal with. IFR conditions up and down the chain tomorrow afternoon. It looks like some breaks around Cold Bay, False Pass, also up into the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula. IFR moving into Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, all the way up to southwestern Capes into the Bering Strait, pushing in toward Prince William Sound, but not quite making it. It looks like MVFR probably as far north as Portage, maybe as far east as Valdez, and probably poking its way into Cordova, and then trying to sneak into the southern outer coast of southeast, but generally VFR there. No big changes for southeast by Saturday morning. IFR outside of Prince William Sound and pushing in toward Kodiak. Looking for some patches in the IFR around the Alaska Peninsula and some of our favorite spots there. Up toward IFR for St. Lawrence Island, St. Matthew, and lifting a little bit around St. Paul and St. George. As we get into Saturday afternoon, that band continues pressing north and east. Looks like Kotzebue Sound, Shishmaref, Kotzebue itself will probably be down, as well as most of Norton Sound, and again a broad area of southwest, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. But marginal conditions should be improving for south central. Will linger under MVFR for all of Kodiak Island, and southeast still hanging on to VFR conditions again, but probably still looking at some pretty big turbulence. Aktuvik and Adigan Pass, as you saw, looks to be all clear for the daytime tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, at least MVFR by the afternoon. I've got the worst case scenario here, but it does look like IFR is going to be a possibility for at least Lake Clark and probably Merrill Pass by the end of the day, if it's aggressive. If not, you might end up with just marginal conditions. Rainy Pass again. This is the worst case scenario. Looks like it will be close. Will it make it into the pass? Not so sure, but plan for it and hope it gets better. Windy Pass, VFR conditions there, as well as Isabel Pass, and Mentasta Pass looks pretty good right now. Tenita Pass, VFR all day long tomorrow. Portage Pass, again, worst case scenario is marginal conditions make its way up to the eastern entrance. But again, that's going to be a little bit of a stretch. Chilkoot and White Pass right now look to be VFR. Freezing levels show that warm air. The next surge kind of dragging that 2,000-foot freezing line north just east of St. Paul and St. George and west of Cape Newenham. Not quite to Sand Point for the 4,000-foot line, and then the next surge developing another bounce in that warm level as it moves into the central and western chain. Out in southeast, you can see warmth trying to work its way northward there. That'll be a big battle, though, in the next couple days, more of a gradient of colder air working its way southward. Icing potential is generally limited to about 6,000 to 8,000 feet across the west and southwest coast all the way down toward Kodiak Island. Generally isolated moderate. A lot of unsettled weather here across the west. Expect at least isolated moderate if you're flying through the Bering, St. Paul, St. George, any part of the chain. And then a couple of breaks in between the waves there. The interior, the north and southeast generally look to have very few, if any, significant icing threats at this point. The jet stream has our powerful Pacific jet aiming in from west to east at about 175 knots, and a lot of unstable movement here in that jet. Low pressure here across the west coast feeding in that excessive blast of colder air. The big cold really coming in off of the flow here through Alaska, 75 knots over the interior from the west and northwest. And you can see high pressure is driving that offshore flow for our friends across the west coast. At 3,000 and 9,000 feet, you can see that broad south and westerly flow over the Bering. That's going to remain unchanged. We've got kind of a semblance of a ridge right here across the midsection, so a lot of variable flow, and then a stronger northwest gradient across southeastern Alaska at 9,000 feet with winds up to 50 knots. That same gradient here is a little less at 3,000 feet, but again, the same pattern is certainly there. South and easterly flow working through the interior, meeting up with a west coast southerly flow. That's pretty extreme across the central and eastern chain, up to 95 knots across Adak and Atka, with a down inlet flow across south central. So turbulence is the rule tomorrow. Severe turbulence possible across the chain at below 4,000 feet. Same goes for most of the west coast. Widespread, considerable moderate and severe over northern southeast.
The Orion Nebula.
Welcome to Stargazers. I'm Dean Regas, astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. We're here to help you find your way around the sky.
One of the best things about winter is that it always brings the return of one of the true wonders of the universe.
That wouldn't be snow, would it?
Not quite, James, but I was thinking of something much farther away, but it's something that is very easy to spot in the winter sky.
Sweet. Let's show you.
We have our skies set up for any night this week at about 7:30 p.m. In the southeast, you'll see what has to be the second most familiar pattern of stars, after the Big Dipper, that is, a pattern which is loaded with bright stars known as Orion the Hunter.
To find him, look for his belt of 3 stars in a row. These are the stars Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka.
Above these 3 belt stars, you'll see 2 brilliant stars marking Orion's shoulders, Betelgeuse and Bellatrix. And below his belt, 2 other stars mark his ankle and his knee, Rigel and Saiph.
We often talk about Orion's bright stars, but for this episode, we would like to zero in on one of Orion's more subtle objects. Look below the belt for 3 much dimmer stars, the stars we call the Sword of Orion. There we'll find one of the most awesome wonders of our nearby universe.
If you look very carefully at these 3 stars in Orion's sword, you'll notice that no matter how sharp your eyesight is, the middle star always seems to look fuzzy or slightly out of focus. And that's because this star is not a star at all, but something we call a nebula.
A nebula is a cosmic cloud of gas and dust, and the Great Nebula of Orion is actually a stellar recycling center. Within this nebula, brand new stars have been and are still being born from the surrounding cloud.
In fact, you can see the Orion Nebula using even the cheapest pair of binoculars. This cloud is illuminated by 4 recently born stars arranged in the shape of a baseball diamond called the trapezium. And these 4 stars can actually be seen with a small telescope. Now, although the Orion Nebula looks tiny, in reality its size is mind-boggling. Believe it or not, there's enough material in this nebula to produce over 10,000 stars the size of our sun. But if you really want to be impressed, check out the width of the Orion Nebula. As nebulae go, this one is gigantic, spanning over 30 light years in diameter.
Just to give you a refresher, a light year is not a measure of time, but a measure of distance. Space is so big and the stars are so far away that we astronomers don't measure the distances between the stars in terrestrial units like miles or kilometers. We use the term light year.
Light travels at a whopping 186,000 miles per second, which is almost 670 million miles per hour. This means that if you were to travel at the speed of light from the Earth to the Moon, you could make the trip in 1.3 seconds. If you traveled from the Earth to the Sun at that same speed, you could make the trip in a little over 8 minutes. And if you were to travel from Earth to Pluto at the speed of light, you could make the trip in about 5 hours.
So we're going to fly through the Orion Nebula and take a closer look at this star factory.
The force of gravity is bringing clouds of gases together, and when they begin fusing elements, bang, a star is born.
Modern telescopes have allowed us to look deep inside the nebula and see newborn stars and disks of material.
These disks could be forming planets like those in our solar system.
It could take thousands or even millions of years for these protoplanetary disks to turn into solar systems, but we'll keep watching.
And you should too. Look for the Orion Nebula this week and peer deep into space. It's all there when you keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And under marine weather, starting with the sea ice edge, you'll continue to see erosion of the ice edge along that southern boundary there. Yesterday we were talking about a change of about 30 to 40 nautical miles as the weather systems are coming through. Wave after wave of southerly winds and storms will be working in, so do expect further erosion from what you see today. The edge has retreated just a little bit, but there's still significant marginal ice around St. Matthew and certainly around Nunivak Island and in the Kuskokwim Delta. Let's take a look at the marine winds. We're going to be looking at a lot of northerly flow coming through the channels on the inside passage. Sustained winds to 60 knots across the north with 12-foot seas. Sustained winds in Stevens Passage at 50 knots with 10-foot seas, 25 knots around the Clarence Strait. And also notice some strong winds coming out of Cross Sound, 40 knots there with an 11-foot sea. These are sustained winds. We're looking at 75-mile-an-hour gusts on in and around Juneau, so expect to see the core of those winds out in the middle of the channels to be probably even stronger. The peak wind should come Friday night, and as we get into Saturday, we're still going to be talking about some stronger gusts to 60 knots, but 35 to 45 knots sustained across the Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal, the Chatham Strait for sure, and then a broad offshore flow from Yakutat all the way down to Craig, 25 to 30 with seas 8 to 9 feet and seas 7 to 9 feet on the inside. So be careful out there and stay safe. Northeasterlies inside of the Prince William Sound region, a gust to 30 knots there, 3-foot seas, gust to 45 outside of the Copper River Delta, 25 knots sustained, and watch for stronger winds coming out of bays and passes there. Northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, 15 to 30, the highest seas, of course, west of the Barrens and outside of Kashamak Bay. Look for northeasterlies to die off just a little bit on Saturday, 10 to 20. Easterly winds inside of Prince William Sound, well, not quite calm, but getting there. 2-foot seas and south and easterly flow across the north and western Gulf. 8-foot seas, pretty commonplace across most areas, including outside of Resurrection Bay. For Friday in Bristol Bay, easterlies at 20 with a 3-foot sea. Southwesterlies starting to build up the peninsula, though, at 25 knots with 5-foot seas on the Bering side, 14-foot seas on the Pacific side. And you can see the effects of low pressure here right over Kodiak Island. Southwesterlies to 15 on the east side and northeasterlies in Shelikof Strait, 20 knots and 5-foot seas there. As we get into Saturday, a broad southwesterly flow is taking over the entire region, 20 to 30 knots in the Bering with 11-foot seas building in, 11 to 20-foot seas they're building down the Pacific coast as they're moving in from the west and southwest, and southerlies working over Kodiak Island, 15 knots with 11-foot seas out across the Pacific. For the Aleutians, obviously very strong winds working through. A series of fronts will be passing close to the region with strong gales and probably low-end storms for some cases, 40 to 50 knots. Seas coming up to 23 to 32 feet south of Adak and Atka, and from Adak to Kiska about 33 feet there. A little bit of relief west of Kiska as we get into Friday. As we get into Saturday, you can see that broad southwesterly flow sweeping through. The highest seas will remain generally south of the chain, and from Kiska to Attu, anywhere from 25 to 26 feet. In some cases, that's going to be running up towards 30, maybe 33 feet there. The broad areas of orange and red should be highlighted there as they are, as those winds are cutting through the chain, especially in the west and a few of the passes there. So be on your guard and be prepared for some nasty weather as we go through the rest of the weekend. Into the Bering across the east and southeast, 30-knot winds there, mainly over the ice, but of course St. Matthew, St. Paul, St. George, all looking at about 13 to 14 footers as we get into Friday with that 30-knot wind. Broad offshore flow continues for the Yukon Delta and the Norton Sound region, 30 to 35 knots, and as the wind moves into the Bering, it'll probably get pretty snotty there closer to the ice edge and chew the edge up substantially. 23 feet around St. Paul and St. George with winds coming in from the south and southwest. Again, high gales and maybe low-end storms in a few cases there with the strongest seas out across the north and west of St. Matthew there, around St. Matthew, 45 knots. For Friday, easterlies over the Beaufort, 20 knots over the ice. Offshore wind from Wainwright all the way down through Kotzebue Sound, 25 to 30, and through the Bering Strait again, also an easterly flow. That may help to pull some of the ice away from the coast. Saturday, not much change there. An east and southeasterly flow for the Chukchi. Broad easterlies over the Beaufort Seacoast again, so not a whole lot of change through the weekend. Tonight's forecast includes high pressure dropping southward, pushing a wall of cold air into the bays and passes of southeast and the Copper River Delta and into parts of Prince William Sound. That is going to drive the wind up through the weekend. A high wind warning for the capital city. That'll go until Saturday there. The peak winds again Friday night with gusts to 75. Winter storm watches across the Bering Strait and all the way down toward the Yukon Delta. Best chance of accumulating snow and the worst wind probably around St. Lawrence Island, as well as the southern coast of the Seward Peninsula and the Chukchi Coast. The Yukon Delta, a better chance for some freezing rain to mix in. Looks like a lot of weather will be passing by south central, but watch for wind to develop across the Gulf Coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.